welcome to everyone to this discussion today at the Africa Energy Indaba, focusing on Africa's energy transition, which is, as you all know, one of the key topics of the debate in the continent. My name is Daniel Schroff. I'm in charge of the Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency team at the African Development Bank, and it is my pleasure to facilitate today's discussion. If we talk, when we talk about the energy transition in Africa, I think there are sort of two key paradoxes that sort of frame that discussion in my opinion. First of all, it's important to recall that Africa has a very low share in terms of global emissions, historically responsible for just about 4% of global emissions, the majority of which in fact coming from land use and not emissions from fossil fuels, although they are growing, or emissions are growing from the power generation sector. Yet at the same time, I think it's also important to recognize that Africa is bearing the brunt of the impacts of climate change. We've seen quite a number of climate change related disasters unfolding across the African continent in recent years, whether that's droughts, floods, cyclones, and the list continues. The second big paradox really that frames from my perspective this discussion is that Africa is still the continent with the largest energy access deficit, with close to 600 million Africans not having access to electricity. And in fact, the 20 least electrified countries in the world are all located in sub-Saharan Africa. The situation looks even worse if we're looking at access to clean cooking solutions, where some 900 million Africans do not have access to those solutions. Clearly the COVID-19 crisis has further exacerbated that situation. Yet at the same time, it's also clear that Africa does have abundant renewable energy resources, whether solar or pretty much all across the continent, wind, geothermal along the East African Rift Valley, and hydropower, particularly in the Central African context. Just to give one figure is that Africa had in 2020 roughly 54 gigawatt of installed renewable energy generation capacity. Now that's a significant figure. However, it's just 2% of the global renewable energy capacity. So most of the renewable energy potential that the continent has remains largely untapped. Many of us have followed or have been at COP26 in November in Glasgow and followed the discussion, and the energy transition was certainly central to the deliberations at COP26. So we will also discuss today how these global context is sort of having an influence on how Africa charts its own energy transition. I think one aspect that we will also discuss with the panelists is how to ensure that this energy transition takes into account the particular African context, ensures that it is a just energy transition, ensuring that it leaves no one behind. So there are many questions that come up in this context, and I'm very fortunate that I'm joined by a very distinguished panel with representatives from sort of the public sector side, representatives from the private sector side, but also representatives sort of bringing the perspective from development finance institutions. Let me very briefly introduce my panelists today, starting in no particular order, but starting with Tabane Sulu, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Richards Bay Industrial Development Zone Company in South Africa, but has also a lot of background in working for the South African government. It's also my pleasure to welcome Louis van Pletzen, who is the founding partner of the Quantum Power Group, and of course been active and involved in many power projects across the continent. Also my pleasure to welcome Kadri Nassib, who is the Executive Director of Energy in the city of Cape Town in South Africa, but also has been involved in many of the policies and discussions around renewables in the South African context. Next, I'm very pleased that Boitumelo Kipele is also joining us. He's working for Enel, obviously one of the large energy companies, and has also been involved, particularly on the regulation side, in the South African context. And last but not least, it's also my pleasure to welcome my colleague, Wale Shonibare, who's the Director for Energy Financial Solutions, Policy and Regulation at the African Development Bank, and has also a lot of background in financing and banking of energy solutions across Africa. So as you see, a very distinguished panel for our conversation today. Maybe to kick off the conversation, and given that we do have representatives that also know the South African context, particularly, maybe we could sort of kick off the conversation zooming in a little bit into South Africa. As you all know, and I mentioned COP26, particular focus was placed on South Africa and South Africa's energy transition. Obviously there are various considerations that will need to be taken into account, including aspects around jobs, aspects around energy security. So let me bring in just against this background, Thabane, who, as I said, is very familiar with that context, just to share his perspective of how that transition can work, sort of what are some of the key aspects that need to be considered. Thabane, if you want to come in sort of to kick us off.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for the opportunity, and also to the members of this panel to share some of our perspectives around the just transition. I like the way you've put it in the opening remarks, that most of the time when we speak about transition, we don't put the word just, and yet for me, it's a very fundamental word that is used as an adjective to define this transition, particularly if you look into our National Development Plan as a country, which is our blueprint in terms of where South Africa is going to transition into energy. From a South African perspective, it brings the just element into the fore. And it's one of the issues that brings a lot of very interesting strategic debates around transition of our fossil fuel into our renewable energy. The reason why this is so important is because we've got to consider various policy options which are informed by socio-economic conditions of our country, particularly taking cognizance into our historical nature in terms of the injustices that the majority of our people have been subjected for. But most importantly is to make sure that our energy transition is not seen as a simple exercise of simply switching from coal to renewable energy. It's much more deeper than that. You'll notice that in our country, the majority of the labor force that is currently operating from the coal-based plants to provide energy supply, particularly in heavy industrial areas and also in urban areas, you'll notice that is informed by a huge black labor force. And our country currently is faced with a number of challenges that have been in our place for quite some time, due in the economic recession that we experienced, but also now due to the pandemic that we have faced. So everything that we do from a strategic perspective point of view, we avoid any jobless element that could affect our job creation strategies that we are putting in place. So it's in that context that therefore it's not a simple exercise of one size fits all solutions. There are various policy options that must be taken cognizance of to make sure that we sustain the labor force that we have. In fact, we look into business strategies that could increase opportunities for our jobs, for our people, especially historical disadvantaged people who may not have the necessary skills to be employable in the markets that is available in the energy space. Now, one of the key things that we are looking at in terms of options that we must have with renewables in particular is to make sure that technologies that are being considered in as part of transition to the new energy alternatives do not create a jobless society. What kind of skills are we going to be providing to the labor force? How do we reskill the labor force? How do we take competitive advantages of the new opportunities that are created by the transition? This is where the just element becomes very imperative. We wouldn't like to see a situation from our perspective where, as we transition to the new energy alternatives, we create a lot of joblessness in our communities, or people do not have relevant skills that the market can absorb. Taking cognizance of the fact that most of the technologies that are being used in the renewable space are imported, and therefore people need to be reskilled. Very few of those technologies are actually manufactured in our country. And that on its own is a key point to be taken cognizance of. So various policy options should be considered. Involvement of communities should be taken cognizance of. Job opportunities and business opportunities for SMMEs within our establishment should also be taken cognizance of as part of the policy options that we must consider as we go into this just transition. So I'd like to emphasize, Daniel, the importance that this transition can only be a great transition only if it remains just at all levels of engagement, at all policy options that we look into. Failure to do that will make this transition very disruptive and very chaotic, and that is not what we want to see. For now, I think the policy options that our government is pursuing are beginning to shape this transition in a better perspective by bringing issues of justice into the fore. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tabane, for that perspective, and I think really emphasizing the sort of the holistic approach that needs to be pursued in looking at the energy transition, but also placing a particular emphasis on the question of jobs. I don't know if some of you saw a recent report released by the International Renewable Energy Agency on the Africa Regional Market Analysis Report, I think in January, which actually looked also at, at the question of jobs. And this is not South Africa specific, this was obviously a continental-wide view, but there one of the key conclusions was that the energy transition, the new technologies, etc., the opportunities also for job creation sort of ultimately sort of outweigh sort of jobs that might be lost from that transition, moving away from certain things. But obviously this needs to be looked at also in a specific local context. Ultimately, this is where things matter. And this is where I think I would like to bring in Kadri, who obviously also in his current role in Cape Town is looking at some of these questions sort of also from the local perspective. Kadri, you want to maybe just come in and sort of expand on some of these points and what you sort of consider sort of some of the key ingredients of making sure that that energy transition indeed is sort of just.
Daniel, thank you. And I think thanks for the opening remarks. I think Tabani also for your remarks. I think they're very relevant, not just obviously in the South African context, but I think in the broader African context. And some of my remarks now will be contextualized obviously from the local government perspective. And that's the space that I'm involved in very actively. But I think it should resonate with a lot of other countries in Africa where there might be similar challenges that are being experienced and perhaps similar reform might be required within the electricity and energy market as a whole. Now, when it comes to a just energy transition, and I'm very grateful that South Africa has embraced this fully, and in fact, Eskom, as the national utility in South Africa, and certainly the largest utility in Africa, has also actively looked to introduce elements of the just energy transition in its operation, and is now in the process of repurposing some of its older stations that are set for decommissioning, with the intention of obviously activating opportunities within the local context. Now, all this is great. And in fact, they've received some very good support coming out of COP as well. There is some green climate financing opportunities that have been made available to recognize, I think, the contribution that Eskom is making in the space. But from a city's perspective, I think we need to take it a step further. Obviously, what is driving urbanization has to be high levels of unemployment. And within the South African context, we know that about 46.6%, if you include those that are actively discouraged from looking for work, that's the level of unemployment in the country at the moment. When you look at unemployed youth, it's 2/3 of youth in this country, in South Africa, that are currently unemployed. And that, of course, creates a huge problem going forward, but it also creates an opportunity for us to consider what are the new pathways? And these new pathways are going to be critical for economic recovery and then growth. And energy, and in particular energy security of supply, is the key enabler or driver of that economic change. So when we talk about the urbanization, and Cape Town is not immune to urbanization, and I'm sure there are many cities around Africa where you've seen a rapid increase in urbanization as those that are more marginalized seek opportunity within the context of larger cities. Cape Town, as I said, is not unique, and we have seen rapid urbanization. The trend continues. And what we need is a defined pathway which is enabled by national government. And once again, I must give credit to national government for coming up with the necessary response from a climate perspective. So there's South Africa taking on ambitious targets, voluntary initiatives that are designed to help mitigate the impact, the emissions of greenhouse gases, but it has to be reconciled with a growing population with inadequate access to energy. And this is the common problem that faces Africa. So we have to do a balancing act. How responsible are we as a nation versus our responsibilities towards those that are impoverished and living in energy poverty? So that is where I think we need to do the juggling act. So how do cities get involved? Well, cities have to open up their markets. Liberalization of markets have to happen. We have to shoulder more responsibility that national governments may not be able to enable and support going forward. It's very important that we start turning our consumers, particularly residential and commercial consumers, into prosumers so that they play an active role in not only providing for energy, for their own energy in particular, but are able to stimulate a market on its own. At the same time, we've seen a rapid increase of independent power producers in the country. One of our panelists represents one of the larger, more successful IPPs in South Africa. We need more opportunities like that, but we need them on the ground as well. So it's all good and well to have certain regions where we have high levels of solar insolation, in other words, good radiation levels that will promote the use of solar. But the question is, where are those benefits localized? Where are they most needed? And they're most needed in cities, where, as I've said to you, urbanization is taking its toll. So we're going to move very fast in this direction as the City of Cape Town. We are going out to market. We have already set up a successful small-scale embedded generation program. We are engaging IPPs with the intention of having power projects installed on our network and then importing power from the rest of the country. And that's a program which I think is being shared by other cities around South Africa. And I see no reason why other cities in Africa, particularly those that are aligned to C40, can't play the same role as what we're trying to do in Cape Town. So I think, Daniel, I'll leave it there. I think there's some food for thought, but I mean, obviously the intention is that we need to start enabling local government to get over the line. And what it needs is the appropriate regulatory reform that says, right, we're enabling and empowering our local governments to take ownership of these issues.
Thank you very much, Kadri. I think you raised quite a number of points on which I think we will sort of follow up from the panel side, including I think sort of the change in the way how we look at sort of the power systems. You mentioned prosumers. Indeed, it's not just the traditional way, generation, transmission, distribution, consumption, but there are flows sort of going in several directions. And sort of that flexibility is certainly a key dimension. You mentioned IPPs, and I see Louis, I think, is ready to come in, which obviously are playing a key role. Yet, if we look at sort of also beyond South Africa in terms of independent power producer projects, it's just a small number of IPPs that sort of close on an annual basis, and clearly not sort of sufficient to meet sort of the energy needs of the continent. So maybe Louis, I bring you in before then moving on to some other panelists. But Louis, sort of what you've heard, kind of the perspective from Thabani, you heard Kadri sort of highlighting some of the opportunities that the transition brings. Sort of what's sort of your perspective in that context?
Yeah, Daniel, thank you. I think to deal with South Africa specifically and then go a little bit wider into Africa, I would say to put the South African debate to bed is just the following perspective. South Africa has, call it 50,000 megawatt of installed generation capacity from coal. These power stations have a remaining 15 to 25 years life left in it. Is that the best use of our money to close those stations down and write off 15 to 25 years of economic life from either of those power stations? My experience is that whenever a so-called word transition is used, it is another way of saying, let's write off other people's money, OPM. That's how this debate is going. Here is the reality. Nowhere in the world can we get by with a single source of generation. And there's a lot to learn from China, by the way. Can I just say, well, South Africa has 50,000 megawatts of generation capacity. China has, during 2021, had more solar generation capacity than the entire world combined. But they have also, during 2021, added 150,000 megawatts of coal-fired power generation. 3 times the size of South Africa they've added in 2021. They have now 1.2 million megawatt of coal-fired power generation, 1.2 thousand gigawatt. So there has to be a transition over time that has already started many years ago. It's not like this morning we realized that there's a climate issue, we need to do it. We've added wind, solar, and other clean sources of generation capacity. The technology improves significantly because we've added them in the olden days when it didn't make sense. My first solar investment had a tariff of, I don't know, more than $1 a kilowatt hour. And because we made those early investments, we were able to get the unit cost down, we're going to get the tariff down, and now it's competitive. But the one thing we know for sure, the sun doesn't shine in the middle of the night. It just won't. It didn't yesterday, wouldn't tomorrow. So you know, for the South African debate, we have to move on from saying because we have 20,000 megawatts of broken coal-fired power generation today, the solution is to build more wind and solar. No, the solution is to fix the 20,000 megawatt coal-fired power generation so that that gives us a leeway to earn the economic return on that money whilst we're adding the other sources of power generation first. The second is we need to clean up the exhaust gas. We cannot stop the exhaust gas. The whole world's industrialized. We cannot stop all sources of exhaust fume. We need to clean it, and carbon capture and storage is coming also forward with great technology, and we will come back on that point. But to shift the debate a little bit to maybe Africa, I would say you started by saying Africa is 3.8% of the world's CO2 emissions. That's sort of broadly the number, call it 3.4, 3.8%. Can I just make a few comparisons? Saudi Aramco level 3 emissions is 4% of the world's total. The airlines is 2% of the world total. The airlines is broadly speaking the same as Africa's emission. The friend from Oxfam here just published yesterday something that says the average British person will have emitted more carbon dioxide in the first 2 weeks of this year than a citizen of any one of the 7 African nations. By 12th of January, he said, we would have exceeded per capita of Madagascar, Malawi, Ethiopia, Uganda, Guinea, and Burkina Faso in 12 days here in the UK. And so we can make the comparison, and that does not mean at all we don't need to take great care of an energy transition. We do, but our comparable here cannot be what is the world doing, and how do we catch up to that? Our comparable is we're doing more damage to the environment by not having reliable, clean, available energy to our population at the moment than the current status quo. We have 64 cities with more than 1 million people in Africa, with urbanization of 50,000 people every day. That is a person every 2 seconds. That means another one just now and another one just now, urbanized. Those people move, they have no water, they have no clean energy, they have no nothing. So in summary on this point, I would say the other fun fact is an average an average American fridge uses 450 kilowatt hour. That is higher than the average energy available to a person in Africa. The energy used by per capita in Africa is lower than an average fridge in the US. So from this perspective, I would say for South Africa, there is an enormous domestic fuel source as coal. It needs to be exploited in a cleaner manner than in the past and in a transitional manner. We talk about importing gas as if it's so easy. We have no gas in South Africa, and the conversion to gas in South Africa will rely on imported gas. So the opportunity for Africa is a transition to bring everybody to a decent available level of electricity, and globally economies are becoming more energy intensive, not less energy intensive.
Thank you very much, Louis, for a lot of very interesting figures and comparisons. I think putting sort of the situation in Africa sort of in the global context. I just wanted to pick up one point that you said at the beginning, sort of referring to the coal power plants in South Africa and sort of the economic lifetime that is rest. But isn't sort of the essence in many respects of the coal transition deal for South Africa that was sort of concluded in Glasgow, basically that there will be sort of financing from some of those countries that have contributed most to sort of emissions in exchange, basically for closing some of these facilities ahead of their sort of economic lifetime. Isn't that sort of addressing to some extent this issue? If basically you close down, but you're not doing this just because this might be sort of the right thing to do, but you're doing it because there is sort of the compensatory resources required to identify the alternatives to make sure that that there are sort of social dimensions being taken care of.
Yeah, that's true. And I'm not the right one to talk about OPM, other people's money. But it is true that France, Germany, and the UK provided $8.5 billion to South Africa for an energy transition. And now you need to say, just again in the perspective, we have 50,000 megawatt of coal-fired power generation. If you have $8.5 billion today to spend, and it's your own money, would the first thing you do is to shut down 50,000 megawatts of coal-fired power plants in South Africa, or would you do something else? I mean, let's just say a basic calculation. It costs $100 for a solar panel, a battery, and a basic home system today, right? $8.5 billion gives me 85 million home systems, average 5 people per home, that's 500 million people. I can give instantly overnight 500 million people basic use of electricity in their homes, which means they don't cut down trees, they can have a decent education, they can have a very basic cooler box for a fridge to keep also medicine and everything else cool. All of these benefits come, you cannot industrialize the continent with rooftop solar. I accept that, but I'm just saying, if this $8.5 billion was your own money, which by the way it is because it's your tax money, but if it was your own money, would you have given that to South Africa today to shut down 50,000 megawatt of coal? Of course you wouldn't. And then the history of South Africa lately is they will lose half.
Right. Thanks for that response. Let me, because we're talking a lot about sort of now also the financing dimension. So let me bring in maybe on this point my colleague Wally Shonibare, sort of just to give a bit, sort of looking at Africa as a whole and sort of the energy transition challenge, sort of what could the pathway look like, and more specifically, how can we mobilize the finance required for such an energy transition?
Thank you very much, Daniel. Thank you, and good morning to other panelists. I think when we talk about Africa, we tend to assume that the situation is the same across the continent, and it's worth just looking at some distinctions across the different parts of Africa. So North Africa relies significantly on gas. They're almost at universal access to electricity in many of the countries, 99% access. But the region is trying to decarbonize. And luckily, they have significant amounts of solar and wind technology. And we've seen success stories in countries like Egypt, in Morocco, and other countries such as Tunisia are starting along that path of integrating more solar and wind into their energy mix. And luckily, because of the strong existing baseload that they have from gas, it's easy for those countries to do that. And now we're seeing opportunities presented to make green hydrogen, and a lot of that will be for export into Europe and other places. So North Africa has chosen its path to decarbonization in a way that suits the existing infrastructure, and it's able to do that because of the legacy infrastructure that it has from its gas network. Now, we've talked a lot about Southern Africa. Again, there's a need to decarbonize from coal. But there's been a lot of talk about gas having a central role in that decarbonization. A lot of that gas may be coming from Mozambique, etc. And you can see the logic of that because of the lower emissions you get from gas, although it's still a fossil fuel. In West, Central, and East Africa, you see significant amount of hydro, geothermal resources. In West Africa in particular, you have gas. They have to choose their own decarbonization paths, but you also see chronic lack of access to electricity. And so when you talk about transition, what are you transitioning from? Because these people don't have access to electricity anyway. And so there's an urgent need to also industrialize many of these countries. So you're looking for a pathway that allows countries to industrialize, to build base load that can also help anchor, more renewables. And this is where we have to think about how all of this is going to be financed, because one of the things that we've seen from trying to develop large projects such as INGA is that the utilities in the region are not strong enough to provide the bankable offtakes that will be required. At one time there was a lot of hope that maybe South Africa would be the anchor off-taker, but we know what state Eskom is in right now. And so if you're going to be able to develop large projects, renewable projects, large hydros, it's very important that we interconnect the entire continent. That this is where the work that we're doing with the African Union on the Continental Master Plan makes a lot of sense in the context of the AFCFTA, which is around encouraging more trade around African countries, the work that we're doing with the power pools to help them develop the trading capacity and also building the regional interconnections. We have to move away from this single buyer model where you're relying on weak utilities essentially to having more of regional markets. And all of these are going to drive the financing. Obviously, we've talked about the need for climate finance for Africa. On average, Africa receives a tiny fraction of the climate finance that is available, $19 billion, which is 4 times lower than what North Africa gets, whereas the investment needs for the adaptation alone between 26 to $41 billion. And we know that Africa's real need is for adaptation finance, having suffered the disproportionate impact of climate change. I was saying to somebody the other day that, look, any project that you build in Africa, electrification projects, is not just a mitigation project, it's actually an adaptation project, because it allows these countries to adapt better to the impact of climate change. So in terms of mobilizing financing, I think everybody has a role to play. The governments have a role to play. In fact, the African Union and African governments have to consolidate their investments and move away from this siloed view, so we take more of a continental view. And also we have to mobilize both local and institutional investors to put the money into the infrastructure that will allow us to anchor more renewables. But on the one hand, knowing that Africa has a real access problem and an industrialization problem, because part of the issue you find in countries such as Kenya or Ghana is you're reaching overcapacity in countries that have low access because there isn't enough industrial use or demand. So the issue of financing is very complex, but the planning, the overall planning is absolutely critical to see how you're going to integrate more renewables. And as other panelists said, Louis said, you have to look at an energy mix that makes sense within the NDC commitments that the countries have made under the Paris agreements and the long-term strategies that have to be put in place. So perhaps I should stop.
Thank you, Wale, for that intervention, and I think you raised quite a number of points on which we can follow up. But maybe let me just pick up on the last point around planning that you just highlighted, and use also that to bring in our last panelist, Boitumelo, so to just come in and provide also that perspective, what sort of needs to happen sort of on the planning side, on the policy side, in order to take into account all the different dimensions of the energy transition that you've heard also from the different panelists. Boitumelo, you want to come in sort of providing sort of your perspective on that topic?
Thank you, Daniel. I just want to latch on some of the points really that are coming, especially from Thabani and from Kadre, and just mixing up some of Louis' points. I think we do have agreement that there are various policy options here that sometimes they are conflicting, and they are also bringing up coming up with certain opportunities that they could be taken advantage of in the shorter space of time. The issue of timing for the energy, the word says itself, it's a transition. It's not a switch on, switch off something tomorrow. It's a transition which in the name itself tells you it's a moving target also. Some academics, they actually even say, you take the transition from coal to oil, it took about 50 years, and now we're trying to move from one source to this advanced technological source, which we're saying, if we then put the just in it, we need to take everyone, we don't need to leave everyone behind. But, from the global perspective, yes, we understand there's pathways to the NDCs, to the 1.5 degrees Celsius. But I want to pick up on something that we can really localize, which are the policy pathways. With the policies that we have at a local level, how can we integrate those policies such that when we say to local government, go and procure energy from independent power producers, what crystallizes the benefits for both local government, but also for the citizens, and given the governance framework where if the city of Cape Town has its own program, possibly it's going to benefit the people within the city of Cape Town or broader within the Western Cape. But how do we then emulate that at a national level, as Katri put it, that they need a direction from national policy in order then to start, realizing some of the benefits of what does it mean for the local government to change its system and to change from buying from Wale mentioned this single buyer model, from buying from this single big utility to buying from multiple players, and how does that then translate in the industrialization within the city of Cape Town? Because I would imagine that if the city of Cape Town wants to build its own power stations or wants IPPs, they will want the IPPs to be within the city. So that industrialization benefits can be there, but now we need to move it also from a national level and to say in undertaking this national industrialization, it can then also move to the local level. But from a private IPP perspective, really, Wale touched on the issues of finance, and I think up to so far where we had in South Africa, especially the Renewable Energy IPP program, which is a government program, lauded internationally as one of the best, auction programs for renewable energy. But we need to move away from that. We need to start looking at innovative ways of how IPPs can participate together with government, together with local government, together with citizens, the creation of prosumers, the changing of the power system to not to be only one-sided, where a utility simply offers its services or offers the energy to users, but for users to interact. Technology is advancing. We can take advantage of that and create these kinds of interdependencies that will make sure that we get more from the opportunities whilst working on making a balance of these policy options. And for obvious reasons, it's an energy mix. We talk of an energy mix. So we need to get what are the ingredients for this mix? What do they mean? And yes, the cost of each, sometimes the costs are not comparable, but how do we make sure that as we look at solar and wind, for example, the cost has gone down, but has that translated into the socio-economic issue if we look at the case not only of South Africa and anywhere else in Africa in terms of affordability? I wanted to bring that element at the end to say, as much as we're taking advantage of the renewables, we also need to bring it to the level of affordability to ensure the access goals that we have.
Thank you very much, Portomelo, for this perspective, and I think you elaborated on some of the points that were also raised in the previous discussion. I just wanted to come back on one point that you raised. I think also Wale alluded to it, and others as well, which is around sort of the energy mix. What is sort of the optimal, the ideal energy mix sort of for that energy transition, of course, recognizing that this will be different from one country to another. And of course, a little bit the elephant in the room in the discussion around the energy mix at the moment when it comes to Africa, but not exclusively Africa, is there a role for natural gas in that transition? If yes, how would that look like? I don't know if the one or other panelist would like to sort of give a perspective maybe on that energy mix question, and maybe also the question around natural gas. I see Louis wants to come in.
Yeah, I will just briefly say, I think there's sort of two sides to an energy mix. There's an energy mix in terms of fuel type, but there's also an energy mix in terms of just scale of energy provision, right? So let's say on fuel type, one has to keep in mind what is the domestic available fuel. And therein lies also a transition, right? If a country is well endowed with peat, should it use peat as an energy transition? Or if it's well endowed with coal, should it use coal in that energy transition? Or would we rather have it import electricity from somewhere else in the form of gas? There is a logic for the baseload requirement of an energy mix. And there are many examples in Africa where a very modest baseload from either gas or coal, or in horribly cases, diesel, has enabled the provision of a factor of 2 times, in one specific case, I think in Senegal, 3 times the size of renewables being added because of that underpinning base load. So I'm all in favor of that. But there's another dimension, which is also what is the energy mix in terms of the provision of the electricity. If you look at all the African utilities, they are very modest companies. They have, at most 500 to 2,000 megawatt of generation capacity. So their ability to give an underlying sound offtake agreement based on a creditworthiness of such a small asset base is humble, and therefore you can, I don't know, what is success if we add a 30 or 50 megawatt solar farm somewhere in an African country? It can never be seen as a success. So there has to be a mix here between how do we prevent further destruction of the continent by giving modest solar panels. Rooftop solar, for instance, can never industrialize a country. But, in Ghana, we cut down 2 million trees a year to make charcoal. And so, we have a huge program to plant trees across the Sahel. We cut down in Africa trees at a multiple of 2 times what we're planting. So there is this sort of balance also. The one is the fuel mix balance. The other is how do we bring electricity to different subsets so that we make an immediate improvement there whilst we build up the large-scale power consumption for industrial and industrialization.
Thanks, Luis. I also want to bring in Kadri on this question, but I think you highlighted a couple of key points. Although I would say, yes, obviously you look at what is sort of the endowment at the national level, but is that actually sufficient? Given that obviously if you would look at it at a regional level, that provides a lot more flexibility. The sun or the wind might not blow in one location, but it might in another location, and that could be balanced and could potentially provide you sort of that base load that you sort of otherwise would have to get through fossil fuel based technologies. But Kadri, maybe you want to come in, bring in your perspective as well, and I think others might want to come in as well.
Thank you. And maybe just to add to what Luis said, for me, the big issue is the difference between capacity and energy. And I think that is a fundamental one, even around the world. I mean, if you look at Australia, where so much surplus solar energy has been put back into the grid, that they're going to have to start looking at ways and means of discouraging so much additional power because it doesn't fit in with the demands of the network at a particular point in time. So energy storage, there's going to have to be, I think, quite a rapid transition to more mature energy storage technologies that are going to fulfill a multitude of functions. In Cape Town, for example, we use Steenbras pump storage plant quite effectively to mitigate load shedding. For those that are not in South Africa, load shedding is a controlled blackout, in a sense, a measure taken by the utility to prevent, I think, a more damaging and widespread uncontrolled blackout. And under those conditions, City of Cape Town is able to reduce the impact using Steenbras. We're now engaging in a process by which we will look to further mitigate the impacts of load shedding. It will come from a variety of sources, and that will include, yes, additional solar. It'll include waste to energy. And this is where I think your point about making available natural resources, available resources within a local context becomes so important. So where you have access to adequate and the right kind of waste, you have to start looking more carefully at waste to energy. For us as a city, we see gas as an interim solution. There's no doubt that gas will play a role regionally, and for me, it still remains a mystery as to why Namibian gas is still not here in South Africa. There's been some success with Pandi gas in Mozambique, and of course, Sasol has reaped the benefits of that. But there has to be, I think, a broader collaboration that takes place within the energy market, within Southern Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, etc. And I think that's where we're not seeing enough movement on the ground. Yes, renewables will be a key driver of change, and we're seeing that. And utilities like NL, I think, are playing a leading role. But going forward, yes, those benefits must be localized. Otherwise, you cannot have, as I've said to you before, developments taking place in a remote part of the country because of the value of the level of the resource, but the local benefits do not materialize. So from that perspective, we are pushing very hard to invite investors to come into cities like Cape Town, put their roots into the ground, set up their solar plants, set up their waste plants, set up wind, a variety of other technologies, even gas, because we need dispatchable power. let's not forget that we cannot rely from an energy perspective only on an intermittent supply from renewables. We need to have dispatchable energy. And so for us, having access to a utility like Eskom is going to remain critical in the foreseeable future because we have ready access to a supply of energy. We won't comment on reliability of that supply today, but that I think is going to be a key mover for us in terms of migrating into a new pathway. Ultimately, hydrogen is going to play a big role. I think there's a big question mark about nuclear, but hydrogen certainly is going to be a key enabler for us towards that new pathways that I've talked about earlier, where we're going to have to transition. Where are those jobs going to come from? It has to be in new energy pathways in particular. Thanks, Daniel.
Thank you, Kadri. I think you highlighted several key aspects, and also green hydrogen that was mentioned, I think also by Wale earlier. Let me bring in also, because we were sort of coming towards the end of the discussion, and I'm sure we could continue for a lot more time, but I would also like to give Tabane, Wale and Boitumelo a quick opportunity for some sort of final reflections on sort of that question around the energy mix, also new opportunities. Tabane, you wanna come in?
Thank you very much, Daniel. Indeed, you have raised a very important aspect of this particular discussion, because if this transition were to be just in the energy perspective, energy mix becomes very central in the manner in which we develop our policy options. As you know, in our integrated resource plan that we have adopted as a policy guideline for our energy efficiencies, this aspect has been clearly outlined, and we have aggregated exactly between gas, nuclear, renewable energy, as well as the current coal-based approach in terms of fossils. How are we dealing with that? It's a very important aspect, because what it does, it also brings an element of cost effectiveness and competitiveness within the space of energy, which is one of the most fundamental challenges that we are faced with in terms of providing services to our people. The absence of energy mix can create monopolies that can monopolize and also, to a certain extent, begin to manipulate the pricing regime of energy supply. And that could exclude other citizens from an affordability point of view to make sure that such a service is provided to all citizens and all citizens can access electricity. In your opening remarks, you made a very important fundamental point. The majority of Africans in the continent of Africa do not have an access to electricity. Energy mix can be used as a catalyst to make sure that we continuously create a conducive environment for all citizens to have an access of energy of whatever form. But also geographically, as I've said earlier on, not one size fits all. We live in different geographic areas. Certain aspects of technologies will require different environments for the provision of some energy. So energy mix becomes a paramount point for strategizing and also for creating a conducive environment for easy access to electricity for all citizens. Thank you very much, Daniel.
Thank you very much, Tabane, for again reiterating the also the link to the lack of access to electricity for many Africans, and the aspect of affordability, which also was highlighted earlier by Boitumelo. Maybe Boitumelo, you want to just come in, given that you've also been emphasizing this aspect.
Thank you, Daniel. I think really, I've also been looking at the brief that we have been given in terms of those three questions, and what runs as a common denominator in those questions is the role of policy. And when you then look at the stats, when we consider the energy mix, what are we seeing? We are seeing a lot of new investment in energy generation going, to the renewables. And, for me then, that says, in terms of these policy options that we're trying to balance, some of them being of a socio-economic nature, some of them having to deal with access, is then to ask the question, how are policymakers ensuring or taking advantage of these kinds of new investments and their role that they can play in fulfilling the goals that we have about access, about affordability, about ensuring that we lift, there's so many of our people in the African continent, from this energy poverty that is being experienced. So there is a role of various stakeholders, be it government, private sector, development banks, as we have here today, local government also. I mean, if you go at local government, and we can't shy away from the fact that renewable energy follows where the resource is. And with that in mind, then we need to think of structural reforms that would say, if there are developments in the city of Cape Town or in the city of eThekwini from a South Africa perspective, but also from a regional perspective, you have entities such as the Southern African Power Pool. We need to open up those regional, aspects. You did mention, Daniel, that, we can take advantage of the fact that if wind is not blowing in Eastern Cape, maybe it's blowing somewhere in Namibia. SEP needs to come to the party here. Let's invest also in the grid integration at country level, at regional level, and with longer term goals of integrating the African continent. So my parting shot is to take advantage of this investment that is there into the various energy generation mix and increase access and ensure affordability through the policy mechanisms that we have at our disposal.
Thank you, Boitumelo, particularly also re-emphasizing the importance and the opportunities that this increased interconnection capacity can present from the perspective of an accelerated energy transition. Let me bring in sort of to close the conversation again, Wale, also your sort of perspective around that question of the energy mix, regional integration, if you can sort of just very succinctly highlight sort of two, three key points from your perspective.
Thanks, Daniel. In terms of the energy mix, I don't think enough is said about the experience of the United States, where over the past 10 or so years, the country has reduced its emissions by about 28%, whilst at the same time increasing the electricity generation capacity. And the way it's done that is because it's managed to increase the share of gas and reduce coal. So as we know, gas emits between 40 to 57% less than coal. So that's a way in which, the ultimate aim is being achieved, which is to reduce emissions. So if you can reduce emissions, use a cleaner fuel, and at the same time also double your share of renewable energy, then it's a win-win. And this is a very clever use of the energy mix without being too dogmatic about whether or not you stop all cheap fossil financing, but it's about using what the country has in a way that achieves the overall objective. And I think many African countries have a lot to learn from this, whereby, we try and manage the level of emissions, but know that ultimately we have to increase generation capacity. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wale, for that final perspective, and also giving, I think, a very interesting example of how sort of that transition is sort of playing out in other parts of the world, and there are definitely lessons to be learned for the African continent. I would really like to use this opportunity to thank the panelists for a very rich and interactive discussion. We've obviously not been able to discuss all the different nuances of this topic, and it's incredibly difficult sort of to try to summarize that discussion, but let me maybe just highlight a couple of points that I took away from this discussion. I think the first is, and this was emphasized by, I think, all the speakers, the importance important when we talk about energy transition to have that adjective very central before of a just energy transition, an energy transition that takes into account the impact on jobs, the impact on communities. It's not, and it's obviously a transition that sort of evolves over time. I think a second key aspect that came out is that obviously we need also to look at Africa and the African energy transition on a country by country basis. There are differences across the different regions, and there's sort of no one size fits all to this energy transition. So the kind of local endowments, etc., will need to be taken into account in charting the way forward for the energy transition. I think in terms of policies, it's been very clear that it really has to be a holistic look at the policy for the energy transition, because it does not just touch on sort of energy policy related matters. It touches on aspects, for example, of industrial policy and many other aspects as well. So it really needs to be an integrated process, taking into account the different aspects of the energy transition and also taking into account that the role that different actors have to play in that process. So it has to be horizontal, it needs to be a multi-stakeholder process. I think it's also been very clear from the discussion that there are tremendous opportunities in Africa when it comes to the energy transition. There are also opportunities in terms of some of the new trends such as energy storage, of course, but also green hydrogen potentially, given that Africa has a lot of theoretical potential for green hydrogen. I think, in fact, the highest, according to an recent IRENA analysis, the highest in the world. But also we had discussed the question around sort of what the ideal energy mix is going to look like. And I think if I would sort of take one word from the discussion, is that we need to look at this from a pragmatic standpoint, sort of not being dogmatic about it, but obviously also seeing how we sort of can chart a way forward that is in line with sort of the commitments that African countries have also made in the context of their global climate commitments, the Paris Agreement, etc. Obviously, there is a need for further discussion, and I'm sure that the discussion will continue during the rest of the Energy Indaba and beyond. So with that, again, a big thank you to everyone, a big thank you to the audience, and a good continuation of the Indaba. Thank you very much.